Hi, everybody. My name is Heidi Nissler. I'm going to be kind of your presenter for the session today. Thank you all for coming. This is recorded, so if you have to leave, you can go back, or if you find it so thrilling that you want to watch it over and over and over again because you can't get enough of special ed finance, like, boy, are you like in for a treat because this will be recorded. I will also I'm just going to make my presentation public so that you can have access to my slide deck, which is a Google Doc. So I will put this in the chat, but I will also bring it up and present it as well. Oops, I just sent it to one person. Sorry, I'll send it to everybody. There we go. So there is a link to the slide deck. But with that, I put more in the slide deck than I had initially planned. So I will do my best to get through as much as I am able. But at any time, if you have questions, you can pop. I did try to break the presentation down into some chunks, and I did leave time after each section for any questions that you might have. But really, anytime you have questions, you can drop those into the chat. My friend Megan is going to be helping to monitor the chat. But the goal is just to provide the goal for today is to provide an overview of special education funding so that wherever you're at in your leadership journey, hopefully you'll take away just a few nuggets of information that can help you be prepared for either what you're doing now or maybe what you hope your next positions to be. There we go. Before I jump in, I would love to introduce one other person who's on this call. Erin Toninato is in this meeting, and she is the Executive Director of MASE. Erin, did you want to say hi a little bit before we jump in?
Sure, I'd love to. Hi, aspiring leaders. So it's probably one of my favorite groups of people. Someone nudged me. Actually, when I was a paraprofessional in '87, which was, I like to say, in the 1900s. And I went on to become a teacher and a director and an executive director. So it's just been a wonderful journey. So I hope someone's nudging you and that when the time comes, you'll pay that forward. But MASE is the professional organization for special education directors, coordinators, and those in leadership positions in Minnesota. So when and if you become a leader as an aspiring leader, hopefully you'll join us at MASE. It's a wonderful network of about 650 active members. So just thrilled that you're all here to learn about special education.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. I'm glad you were able to pop in for a little bit. So with that, I will start sharing my screen. Okay. Is everybody able to see my screen? Okay. And I'm not going into present mode because I want to make sure that I can still see you guys the best that I'm able as well. Here we go. So here's kind of our plan for tonight. I'm going to start with just a little bit of an overview and then talk about some of the different types of funding and go into how some of those are calculated. I'm sorry, my lighting is a little bit odd because of the window. For those of you that had registered a little farther in advance, I did send out a survey, and I'm trying to include some of the requests or questions that did come through on the survey. For those of you that did submit that, it's a lot. I think I have just over 50 slides. So we'll see how much we get through. And I promise we can be done at 3:30. An hour and a half is still a long time to talk special ed finance. So just a quick introduction. Like I said, I'm Heidi Nissler. I'm the Associate Superintendent, or Assistant, not Associate, Assistant Superintendent of Specialized Services for St. Paul Public Schools. I've only been in this position for about 6.5 months, but I've been in leadership positions for a while. And throughout any of the positions that I've been in, starting when I was a supervisor, special ed finance has always been a love of mine. And with that, I'll just kind of give a little bit of a caveat too. Like, the information I'm sharing is the best knowledge information I have as of today, and things can change over time, but just wanted to share just an overview so that hopefully you can feel more confident with what can sometimes be one of the scarier parts of leadership, just because a lot of this is really complicated. And then, as I mentioned, my friend Megan from Hastings is going to be helping to monitor and facilitate. So again, if you have questions, you can, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, you can drop those into the chat, and Megan will be helping to monitor and support that. So we'll start with an overview, and I kind of alluded to this already. And I think the goal for tonight would just be like, maybe there's one or two or a couple things that you'd be able to take away. I've been in leadership for 10 years and I'm still learning. And there are many directors that will be very upfront that special education funding is not an area of strength. You do not need to be an expert in special education funding to look to be a director or administrator. The most important thing you can do is build your professional network. And just by being here, like, I can be part of your network. I'll share my contact information. And again, just maybe set the goal, take away one or two new things, and you can forget everything else that I talk about. So one thing, just as a base before we start talking, the base for coding, and one important thing just to have a general understanding is that Minnesota has a uniform system for how we code. This was related to a question that somebody had asked, and I couldn't find a great place to include it, so I just put it kind of randomly at the beginning. UFAR stands for the Uniform Financial Accounting and Reporting System. I included a link. This is just the way that every purchase you make, there's a code that gets associated with that. Later in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about coding for disabilities. Your finance code indicates if this is state or federal. And so there's just a lot of different parts of the code. You don't have to be an expert at this. If you aspire to be a director or in a position like that, there will be people that can help you learn this. But I just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview, because at some point we'll talk a little bit about coding. And again, every disability has a separate code. And so that is listed here. Those are your program codes. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but here, this was just a little bit of an overview before we jump in. So one of the most important things to just have a basic understanding of when we're talking about special ed finance is special education is not the same as special services. So like my position right now is considered special services because I oversee health and wellness and care and treatment. But when we're talking about special education funding, that is specific to special education, which is students who have IEPs related to a disability for which they've met eligibility. From birth through 22 through 21 to age 22. That special education funding is specific to special education. That some of those other types of special services may have some different funding streams or no funding at all, but it's really important to just be grounded in when we're talking special education funding, it really is special education only. At its most basic level, special education is funded through two primary ways. One is through the federal government, the Office of Special Education Programs, which is the money is set at the federal level, at the legislative level, and allocated out to the states. But every public school district does receive federal funds. In addition to your federal funds, there are state funds that are set forth and established by the state government through statute legislation that is put in place, and then MDE helps to distribute those funds from the state to districts. And while both federal and state funds flow through MDE, they are very different buckets of money when they come to your district. As we all know, because I assume most of you are already in the field of special education, when you add up what you receive in your federal special education funds and your state special education funds, it's not enough money. It's not even close to covering the full cost of special education. And because it's not fully funded, districts have to use their general fund or their local funds to finish covering the full cost of special education. And that is what we refer to as the special education cross subsidy. So the special education cross subsidy is the amount of general education revenue that your district is having to use to cover the cost of special education that isn't covered by the funding that your district receives. Okay, apparently I didn't put in a question slide. Any questions so far before we start jumping into federal funds? Okay, here we go. We will continue on. Let the party begin. So federal funding, when IDEA was established many decades ago, the original promise was that they would cover funding to cover 40% of the cost of special education. We have never even come close to that. Typically, your federal funds will cover about 13 to 16% of your special education costs. So again, not barely a third of what the government had initially committed to, and we are not even close to that. So I do have a bit of a graph, and again, it might be small because of the way I'm presenting my slideshow, that typically it floats between 13 and 15, 16%. You do see one year, which is 2009, in which there was a spike. That was one-time federal stimulus dollars during the recession, that there was a large federal package that included one-time stimulus funds that went out to districts, but that funding was not sustained, and we have never come close to that level again. There are three main buckets of federal special education funds. They're referred to by their FIN numbers, which is kind of goes back to here. So your FIN number, your finance number, is part of that UFARS coding and goes right here. It's this sequence of three numbers. So sorry, just going back to the slide. FIN 419 is your federal special education funds that are that's designed to serve students that are Part B eligible, the full range. So students from age 3 all the way up to 22. Sorry, it is 22 now. And this funding can be used to support students or staff at those age levels. You also have two smaller buckets of money. FIN 420 is for students receiving special education services who are ages 3 to 5. So it's your preschool age students. And then FIN 422 are your federal special education funds for students ages birth to 3. Your FIN 419 is significantly more. That I can't remember offhand what mine is in St. Paul, but it's, I would say, I approximately your FIN 419 is probably about 75% of your federal funds, and the other two combined are maybe about 25%. I apologize, I don't have that offhand right now. But it's your 419 funds are your most significant source of federal revenue. The calculation for district allocation for your federal funds is absolutely wild, and it makes no sense. So if you walk away with one thing that you've learned about federal special education funds, it is that the calculation is ridiculous. So for each of those different types of funding, the calculation starts based on the number of students receiving special education services in what they refer to as their base year, which was either 1996 or 1998. And as I'm sure most of you can experience or can attest to, nothing in our schools looks the same as it did that many years ago. And so when we are being allocated our federal funds, the first part of that allocation has to do with numbers from 1996 or 1998. Then the calculation transitions to current year numbers. So then they take into account your total district enrollment, and then the percentage of the students in your district who receive educational benefits, which is students who qualify for free or reduced programming. But the core basic part of the calculation is based off of students served in special education in 1996 or 1998. Isn't that a fun fact? And then, so there are reports available on the Minnesota Department of Education website that tell you what your federal allocations are. Federal allocations come out as an initial estimated allocation amount, but then you'll receive your final allocation amount in the spring. So you'll have an idea at the start of the school year what you think your federal funds are going to be, but you always have to be a little bit careful because there will be an adjustment based on those 2 current year enrollments that could impact what your district actually receives. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the Minnesota funding reports. But I did list here what that, how to find those reports. Okay, I'm just going to walk through this once. So the Minnesota Department of Education website, Data Center, Data Reports and Analytics. I always just search MFR. Minnesota funding reports. If you're not already familiar with that, there's a lot of resources that I'll reference tonight that are in here. Okay, and then just a cheat, I entered 999-99 because that'll give you a statewide report. Okay. And then special education federal allocation. And then this will list out the allocation that your district will receive. So this is your flow through entitlement is $419, preschool entitlement is $420. And then it'll break it down, and you can receive anything from Minneapolis receives $2.7 million in federal 419 funds to districts like Comfrey that receive 8,000. So there, it is very dependent on the unique demographics of your district. Okay. A few points to mention about federal funds that are unique to federal funds. When federal funds get allocated out to your district, they are there for you to use that year. It's not a reimbursement. What you pay for and with your federal funds, you are fully paying for with those funds. And in some ways, they're almost like a little bit of a savings account because they are allocated out to the district, and you can either use them right away that year or the following year as well. And so at times, federal funds are what I would hold back if I know, for example, there's been times that I've reserved some of my federal funds to carry over to the next year because I know that I'm going to be needing to add more center-based programs, and I'm going to have to be purchasing instructional materials and equipment, doing more professional development. There are some implications for maintenance of effort, which I'll get to later. And federal funds are usually how districts would be paying for their director of special education, their supervisors, any centralized support, typically go to federal education funding. And there's some nuances now with the state funding where there's some wild things you can do there, but typically districts would pay for their administrative support and their central office support through federal funding. I think I put it on one of the final slides, but really federal funding is often going to be where you would code things that are supports for staff. So if it's professional development for staff, if is your supervisors that are primarily supporting your special education teachers, those types of support personnel or needs would be coded to your federal funds. Okay, any questions on federal funds? Believe it or not, that's the more straightforward funding stream. Any questions? Okay. Here we go. The next part is where it starts to get even crazier. So your state special education funding formula. Again, like if you thought 1996 and 1998 was a little bit crazy. Just wait till you get to the complexities of our state special education funding. We don't have to travel back in time to 1996, but there's things in the funding formula that absolutely don't make much sense. One of the biggest differences between your federal and your state special education funding, federal you receive upfront, you can spend it right away, you can fully cover the cost. State special education funding is a reimbursement model, and you don't receive 100% reimbursement. So that's where your special education cross subsidy is really, really taking into account. However, if the federals met their obligation, their commitment to 40%, states would be in a different position. But a challenge with state special education funding and that reimbursement model is, like, for example, in my district, we had to add 10 center-based classrooms this year. We serve almost 6,000 students with disabilities. So just for scale, adding 10 classrooms came with a significant cost that, because we don't get any reimbursement until next year, our general fund has to cover that full cost this current year, because we don't see any aid on that till next year. So that's one of the biggest challenges with that reimbursement model is if you are adding programs or increasing costs, your district has to cover those costs using general funds that first year. And another piece, and one thing to ground ourselves in when we're talking special education funding, because this does tie into the state special education calculation, is that, as I'm sure every single one of us on this call strongly believe, students with disabilities are general education students first, and all students generate general education revenue. And so part of the current special education funding formula does a little bit of an adjustment in special education funding in regards to taking some of what would have been allocated as general education funding and kind of transferring that to your special education funding, with the kind of belief that if a student is in a setting 3 or 4 program, they are not accessing the same level of general education supports. So there's ethical, philosophical questions about that, but just that does come into play when we're talking about the state special education funding formula. There we go. So all students, all general education students generate gen ed revenue. Only students receiving special education services generate special education aid. The calculation is absolutely complicated. I will try to break it down so that if you want, you may have some tools to be able to speak to it if you are ever in a position where you are presenting a portfolio for licensure, or if you are applying a position. Like, hopefully some of what I'm going to share with you would give you just a general understanding of the different parts of this process. Before I start going into what the funding formula is right now, as I made a note here, prior to 2016, there was a little bit more of a straightforward special education funding formula in Minnesota, in which special education staff salaries would be reimbursed at 68%. If you had contracted services, so if you were contracting with a staff, like right now I'm contracting with ProCare for a couple special education teachers, you would receive 50% of that contracted amount back. And supplies and equipment that you would purchase for students to use directly, you would receive 47%. So if I was hiring a teacher and I knew that their salary was going to be $60,000, I could anticipate, okay, I'm going to get 68% of that salary back. The funding formula has completely changed, but there are references to this 2016. So I just wanted to share that at the beginning, because that comes into play several times during the current funding formula. We already talked about the special education cross subsidy, which is the difference between all of your special education costs and all of the revenue that you receive. So here we go. So part 1 of the state aid calculation. So I'm going to walk through the different steps, and then we will pull a report from MDE and walk through that district as an example of where this information is located on that comprehensive aid report. So the first part of your special education state aid calculation is calculated 3 different ways, and your district gets the lowest of the 3 options. So option 1 is actually listed as the old formula. So this is these things: your salaries, your contracted services, and supplies and equipment. But instead of these percentages, option 1 takes those expenditures and you get 62% of that. So if you have $1 million in special education expenses under the old formula, the first part of your calculation would be that you would get $620,000. That's option 1. Option 2 is taking all of your non-federal eligible expenditures. So one thing you'll notice is that in this option 1, it said salaries, but it said nothing about benefits. And benefits can be upwards of 30-35% of what that salary is. It's a significant cost that does not go into option 1. So option 2 takes those salaries into account. There's also in the old formula, it was really only staff that were working directly with students that could be eligible for special education aid. Some other special education costs that, if you don't cover them with your federal special education funds, could fall into this non-federal piece as well. But the biggest chunk that gets included in this are your staff benefits. And so they take all of that, which would include a lot of the old formula calculation, plus your staff benefits, plus a few other things that wouldn't have been covered in your old formula, and you get 50% of those of that funding. So if you add up all of that and it was $1.5 million, 50% of that would be $750,000. Option 3 is census-based. There is a calculation that is based on the students in your child count, and each type of disability has a monetary value attached to it. When we get to the comprehensive aid report, I'll show you some of that, but then it also takes into account the students who receive educational benefits, so the percentage of students in your district who receive free and reduced programming. One important thing with all of these different information is that it uses prior year data. So option 1 and option 2 are based on the money that you spent last year, because you're being reimbursed on what you already spent. And so right now in 23-24, we're receiving aid and it's being calculated on expenditures from the last school year. And similarly for your census-based, that is based on the actual students that you are, that is based on students, not your total cost. It is based on your previous December 1st child count. And that is your December 1st child count that everybody talks about. This is where that child count comes into play, is for the next fiscal year. So our December 1st child count that we just had, December 1st of 2023, that's going to be used in this calculation for the 24-25 school year. So that is step 1, which is your initial aid. So for every district, all 3 of these options get calculated by MDE, and then your district receives whichever one is the lowest amount. And again, in a little bit, I'll show you where that is on the comprehensive aid report. After step 1, we go to step 2, which is called excess cost aid. And again, because we can, or because they can, it's calculated 2 different ways, but except this time you get the higher amount. So the first calculation is referred to as the old formula calculation. And this takes 2 different data points into play and makes a calculation. They're looking at 62% of the difference between the unreimbursed old formula expenditures, and then they also take into account 2.5% of the district's general education revenue. And then there's also a non-federal calculation, which is taking those same non-federal categories, which now is including benefits, and 7% of the district's general education revenue. The MDE calculates both of those, and for this one, you get the higher. So step one, they calculate it 3 ways, you get the lower. Step 2, your excess cost aid, they calculate it 2 ways, and you get the higher. And again, all of this is based on prior year costs. Then there's step 3, which is transportation. This, like, notice there's only like 5 words on this slide because special education transportation is reimbursed at a rate of 100%. The challenge with special education transportation is just finding the staff, having the buses. But if you can get all of that into place, you will receive 100% reimbursement. But again, if you have increased costs for transportation one year, your district has to cover those costs until you get that state aid the following year. But at least you will be reimbursed at 100% to fully cover the cost of transportation. And for a while, that was the end. Up until, I don't remember which year it was, that was really kind of where the funding formula ended. But now we have excess cost aid, and then we have additional cross subsidy reduction aid. So there's 2 more steps to your state aid calculation. So for the cross subsidy reduction aid, oh wait, nope, we already did excess cost aid. One more step. Sorry, I misspoke for a bit. I was hopeful that there was more complication to this. During the last legislative session in 2023, there was really great momentum. After many years, additional funding was allocated to cover more of the special education cross subsidy, which is fantastic. It has been something that many organizations, including MASE, have been pushing for years. And it's really exciting. So what this calculation does is it takes into account your remaining special education cross subsidy. So up until this point, districts would generally be receiving about 65-ish% reimbursement of their special education expenditures. So there was still a really significant amount of special education cross subsidy in every single district. This additional funding helps. It doesn't completely cover, but we are moving in the right direction. So to calculate your special education cross subsidy reduction aid, you take all of your remaining cross subsidy, and then it's multiplied by the aid factor. During FY23, which is the 22-23 school year, and it was 6.43%. That was already in place, and 6% covered very, very little. The additional funding that was passed during the spring of 2023 last session increased that to 44%. So when you take what had been remaining, it's that amount is just multiplied by 0.44, and you receive that much in additional cross subsidy funding. Starting in FY27, which is the 26-27 school year, that will be funded at 50%. So we have another bump coming in a few years to help close that gap, but there is still going to be a gap. And then to really get your total amount, we add all of that together. So it starts with your initial special education aid, which again is you calculate it 3 ways, you get the lowest. And then you get your excess cost aid, which is calculated 2 ways, you get the higher amount. Then you get 100% of your prior year transportation costs. And then you get your cross subsidy reduction aid, where for the current fiscal year, it's 44% of whatever that remaining amount had been. Add all of that together, and that is your state special education aid. And if you thought listening to it was complex and confusing, just wait till we pull up the actual comprehensive aid report. Any questions so far? We will go through so that you can see where this is for your district and see what those amounts are. Okay, so I have instructions on how to find your comprehensive aid report. And I do have slides in here that kind of breaks down where that is at. So if you would rather pull up, here, I'll still pull up a comprehensive aid report so that you can see what it looks like. So if you are back at this data center, data reports and analytics, and then I always just search for MFR, Minnesota funding reports. You would look up your district. Megan, do you mind if I pull up Hastings just because I think it's more representative of most districts? I think St. Paul is not a great one to look at because it's so rare with the size of the district. So you find your school district, special education year, we'll go with this year because this year's data is based on last year's expenditures and last year's students. And then what you are looking for is your special education comprehensive aid report. This one right here. The list reports. So I'll walk through it on here, but just note, if you want to go back later, I do have slides that lay out the same thing that I'm going to talk through. So that you have that as a reference point. So when you pull up your report, it's a 4-page report that looks like it was developed on like the original like Apple computers in like 1989. So basically we're traveling back in time as we look through these reports. So you know you're looking at the right report when you see comprehensive aid report, and it'll say data year 23-24, and it even gives you that really handy dandy reminder that it is using prior year data from the 22-23 school year. And then we start to break down the actual parts of the calculation. So as a reminder, the first part of the calculation is calculating it in 3 different ways, and you get the lower. So the first thing you'll see is special education initial aid. So that's your step 1. Option 1, old formula expenditures. It literally even says old formula, which is what that formula had been prior to 2016. So it will look at your special education expenditures. This pulls in ESY. If you are in an ADSIS district, it does include ADSIS. So ADSIS is pulled into this as well. That's what this alternative prevention program is. It also pulls in some of your third-party billing expenditures that would be eligible for special education funding. And then if you have an ACTI-SPED program, transition disabled program is what they'll refer to you. And then they add all of that up. Here's your total. And this is where you get 62% of that amount. So this is the amount for calculation 1 or option 1. Then we get to option 2, which was all of your non-federal funds. So anything that you didn't use your federal funds to cover get put into this bucket. And so this is your so it takes this amount and adds more. So then it looks at unreimbursable, non-federal. A lot of this is going to be your benefits that are allocated out to staff. Like I said, usually benefits are about 30% of what that salary is, which is pretty close here. This was a little over 6 million. This is a little over 2 million. So a lot of that is going to be the health insurance, dental insurance, all of those benefits that are paid out to your special education staff. It also pulls in, this is ADSIS again, which is here, creates this additional $2.48 million that then gets added to this amount, giving you your non-federal amount, and then you get 50% of that. So right now we already have 2 calculated, 4.03 million and 4.49. And so this one is still the lower. So that one's the winner so far. Then we go down to page 2. and this is your census-based aid calculation. So this is where every disability is assigned a monetary value, and then it's multiplied by how many students in your district receive special education services by that disability. And it also takes into account the size of your district and free and reduced lunch. So up here, some of this is just that there's a basic allowance calculation. Again, free and reduced lunch, total free. So there's different calculations up here, but then when you get to this middle is where you're going to see the values that are assigned to the different disabilities. Over here, it says level 2, 3, 4. That does not mean federal setting. This is completely different than the federal setting that you would see on a student's IEP. It has to do with what kind of tier of funding are they put into, because they have different amounts. Level 2 is, for every student, it would be 13,300. But when you look at the disabilities, it's ASD, developmental delay, and severely multiply impaired. So if you have a child who qualifies SMI, that is calculated at $13,000, which is the lowest of the values. Again, this is part of where what is taken into account is that general education, all students are general education students first. So bear with me. The next level is 19,000, and that is DHH and EBD. And then where you receive the most funding is students who are DCD mild to moderate, DCD severe profound, PI, VI, and deafblind. And for each of those students, you would receive $25,000. So all of that is calculated. This count is how many students in your district are eligible in those areas. And then it starts to do the calculation. And then down here, line 42 gives you this total calculation. So your census-based calculation for Hastings is $6.2 million, which in theory, if we were able to get the highest, that would be fantastic. But then that's compared against option 1 and option 2, and you get the lowest. So for Hastings, their initial aid calculation is based off of the first option, which is the old formula aid, which was $4 million. So there is 2 pages that all just go into calculating that first step, in which you get the lowest of the 3. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, then we get down to page 3, where they start to calculate the special education excess cost. So this is where it's calculated 2 different ways, and you get the higher this time. So this first section is pulling forward some additional information that may be on other lines. So it is looking at your old formula reimbursable, which was, okay, I won't go there. Your non-federal expenditures, it even tells you what line it's pulling from, and your actual special education initial aid. So a lot of this beginning is pulling forward, and then it's also pulling forward your district's general education revenue from the state from the prior year, because that gets taken into account here. And then there's some different ratios. But then down here in calculation A is where it starts to do the first calculation for step 2, which is taking into account your old formula costs, 2%, 2.5% of your gen ed revenue, and then it's giving you your total calculation for this would be $874,000 in aid. But then they go to calculation B, which is looking at your non-federal expenditures again. And that calculates to $1.49 million. So a pretty big difference, 800,000 to just shy of 1.5. And this time Hastings gets the higher. So here for the excess cost aid, they get almost $1.5 million with this calculation, which is what is shown here. The next section is just your transportation aid. So here's your special education transportation. And as some of you may know, care and treatment transportation gets funded through special education funding as well. So that is what this line is. So they're taking your special education transportation costs plus your costs of transporting students to care and treatment settings, and this is what you would receive for your special education transportation. Again, straightforward. It's only like 6 lines, 7 lines, and you get 100%. And then down here is where they do kind of an initial summary. So it's taking your initial aid from that first calculation, your excess cost aid, which was that second step where they calculate it 2 times and you get the higher, your transportation aid, and then they give you kind of a tentative total, which for Hastings is just over $9 million. But then there's this tuition adjustment. I'll get a little, I have some slides on tuition adjustment. Your special education state aid is calculated based on your resident students. So if you are a district that has a lot of students that open enroll to other districts, those students are still included in your district's special education aid, not by where the district they are actually attending. The same goes if you are a district that has students that are referred to an intermediate district or an education district or a special ed cooperative. If that's, you know, if you have students that are referred to a setting 4, those students are you are responsible for the cost of those students. So this is what you pay out to other districts to educate students who are your students but receiving services enrolled in a different school district. So that's what that tuition adjustment is. And so what this shows is Hastings is paying out to other districts. MDE oversees all this. You don't have to manage this yourself. I mean, almost $1 million. But what I will say is knowing Hastings is part of an intermediate district. And for districts that are members of an intermediate district, it's not unusual to see a really significant number here. But it is really interesting if you pull up this type of report for a district that receives a lot of students who open enroll to that district, they will actually receive additional funding through this tuition adjustment. For example, a Minnetonka has a lot of students that open enroll. So if you look at this, I would hypothesize that this would actually be a positive number based on the students that choose to open enroll to that district. So that's what that tuition billing is. And so MDE takes care of all of that on the back end. And so what that would do is here's your special ed state aid. It adjusts for tuition, and then here's your net aid. We're not done yet though. So up until a couple years ago, this is where it would end. And then I don't remember what year it was. It might have been about 2019, 2000. I started my first director position in the 1920 school year, and I think it was around that time some cross subsidy funding came into play, and that is what is calculated on this last page. So this is again pulling forward some different amounts. It's calculating some of your hold harmless. And so when the special education funding formula was changed in 2016, a commitment that MDE and the legislature made is that with all of these new convoluted calculations, no district would receive less than they had been before. And so part of this is just calculating some of that, but there's also a little bit of an inflationary factor. So so that's what a lot of that is, but you will not have to ever speak to that. So I'll skim over that, but just know that that's a lot of what it is. But then down here is, there's a few things that are interested. Line 75C is an interesting line. What you'll notice is Gen Ed to defray the cost of special education. This is the line where you will see what I was referencing earlier when I talked about that part of the funding formula will calculate the students that are in a federal setting 3 or federal setting 4 and essentially take some of the general education revenue and reallocate that as if it were special education revenue. So that is what this line here is general education to defray the cost of special education. And just as an aside, there's some conversations happening about how we might be able to change that, just given, you know, everybody's beliefs about general education is everybody. And then it starts to calculate your special education cross subsidy aid. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm looking at the correct line. Okay. Yes, okay, I need to just look back at my slides for a sec. Okay, 75C. Sorry, I have a lot of reports over. Okay, so what is remaining here? 75D is your what is remaining as your special education cross subsidy. So in Hastings, after all of that aid that they are receiving through those first parts of the calculation, they still had almost $5 million in special education cross subsidy. So they are having to use almost $5 million of general education revenue. And the next line down, this 0.44, that is at 44% of the special education cross subsidy that I mentioned. So right now it's 44%, next year it's 44%, and then just to show you where it was on the slides, starting in the 26-27 school year, that 0.44 will go up to 50%. And so then through this special education cross subsidy aid, Hastings gets another $2.1 million. And so that gets you your gross special education aid. So for Hastings, their special education aid totals just over $10 million. This is the end of the report. This proration factor is not anything that really applies right now. So prior to 2016 and the old formula, the state didn't allocate enough money to fully cover all of the special education costs that districts had. So the amount of funding you received was prorated. So it may be that when you added up all the districts, there was only enough funding available to cover about 95%. So what you should have been receiving was prorated by 95%, and that's actually what you received. So that's what that line means. That proration factor. It's not in effect right now, but in theory, if district special education expenses went way beyond what the legislature had allocated, that could come back into play someday. And that is your state special education funding formula. So again, I have slides here that break down kind of page by page the funding formula, so that if you want to go back through and look through another district or look through your own district, it points out where on those slides that information can be found. Any questions on what I went over? Is it kind of making as much sense as it reasonably could? I've probably sat through at least like 10 to 15 presentations about the special education funding formula, and there are still things that I have to go back and double check. Okay. One important thing about special education funding that you may hear referred to, and especially as you're looking to maybe transition to your first leadership position, or if you're already in a leadership position and you're thinking about a director position or something like that, one phrase that gets talked about quite a bit is maintenance of effort, or lovingly referred to as MO. And what this is there are federal and state requirements to maintain effort, i.e. maintain funding for special education. So what that really means is from year to year, you have to spend at least the same amount of local or state and local funds to provide special education to your district. If you don't maintain effort, the US Department of Education will recover funds. So take funds from your district, and they won't take special education funds, they will take general education funds. You don't ever want to get into issues with maintenance of effort. However, there are some allowable reasons for you to spend less from year to year, but those are really limited. So there are maintenance of effort is calculated 4 different ways, and you only have to maintain one. So you can not maintain in 3 of the ways, and as long as you maintain one, you are good to go for that year. So when I'm saying, there's 4 calculations here. MDE will calculate this for you, and again, you only have to. So it's looking at how much are you spending locally, your state and local funds, breaking that down per pupil, and then again, state and local funds per pupil. I think that when talking about maintenance of effort, one of the most important things to know is that there are some exceptions to maintenance of effort. I have been in districts where we did not maintain effort, and we were able to get approval because we were able to provide documentation of the exceptions. So one example is reduction in child count. So if you are in a district that has decreasing enrollment by a significant amount, I've seen this in outstate Minnesota where your child count is really small, and you may be going from a child count of 200 students, and within 5 years, you may be down to 140 or 150 students. You can provide justification to MDE where they would look at that and could approve your exemption. Voluntary staff departures is what I have leaned heavily into. So if you have 10 teachers that resign and you choose not to backfill those positions, or if they retire, if they voluntarily departed the district, you can reduce that entire amount for their salaries and benefits. Another one is a high cost student. A friend, colleague of mine received the dreaded "you did not maintain effort" email from MDE. It's not a letter, it's an email sent from Paul Farron on behalf of somebody else in the Department of Education that said they did not maintain effort. But what they were able to do is identify, I think it was like 7 or 8 students that had been in a Setting 4 program through an intermediate district. Each of those students cost about $70,000 to $100,000, and because all of those students had graduated the year before, or moved out of the district, or had transitioned back to the resident district, they were able to justify the expenses because those were really expensive students that no longer needed that level of service or had exited the district. And then again, or an elimination of a one-time expenditure. So if there was something that you needed to buy or purchase that was really expensive, and it was only a one-time purchase, you'd be able to provide justification to MDE. And so just kind of the general recommendation is though it's a possibility to justify reductions, avoid maintenance of effort issues when you can. And again, if you're thinking about interviews or how to talk about this, again, we want to avoid maintenance of effort, but if you are in a position like I have been, there are ways to justify those reductions, and there are some people at MDE or others like myself that would be willing to help you through that. Any questions about maintenance of effort? Okay. I'll talk a little bit about tuition billing. I had mentioned this earlier. So tuition billing is when a student receives receives special ed services in any district other than where they physically reside or their parents physically reside. This includes students who are placed in a co-op, education district, intermediate district, some other organization that, or some other district that has a Setting 4 program. And this also includes students who are open enrolled to other districts, as is a lot of where it comes in. And so somebody had submitted via the questions ahead of time, like, what is this I hear about tuition billing rates and how people are coded? So that's why I put this in here. So if you ever hear anybody talking about, oh, we have to be looking at how our teachers are coded or speech language pathologists are coded, that has to do with tuition billing rates, because for each categorical disability, a rate gets established in your district based off of how many staff you have coded to that disability versus how many students. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying straight up number of students, but there's a rate calculated based on the total amount of costs, which is really your staff. Most of that is going to be your staff, and then the students with those disabilities. So all special education staff are coded to a disability. So when we look back at this UFARS coding, everybody is coded to a disability. So if you are a teacher in a center-based ASD program, very likely you are coded to 411, which is ASD. If you are a teacher who is a DHH teacher, all likelihood you are coded 405. But where districts often run into issues with tuition billing is you have all of your speech language pathologists, and for many years, districts would code all of their speech language pathologists to disability 401 speech language. But what that was indicating to MDE is that they were only working with students who only qualified for speech, when in fact that may be part of the students that they work with, but they work with students with all of these disabilities. If you code too many staff to just one disability, that rate that gets set for that disability gets way too high. And what that often means is that there's a different disability where that rate gets set for too low. Because when that rate is calculated for that disability, you receive tuition from that other that is how MDE calculates how much you receive for a student that you may be serving that is open enrolled from another district, or what you pay out to that other district is calculated there. So yeah, so if you code too many, the rate will be set too high. If you don't code enough, it'll be set too low. Here we go. So there is a report that can show you what your tuition billing rates are. I'll walk through it and kind of just show you an example. So here's, again, it's a slightly different spot. It is not, okay, actually, before I get to where to find it, there are some MDE resources around tuition billing, which is up here. If you don't already know about this, there is a special education funding guide that has honestly some really good resources. Many of them were updated during COVID and were given to some other directors to provide some feedback on. And so this has a lot of the information that I presented about state special education aid, maintenance of effort, and there is a chapter on tuition billing, section 25. So if you really want to learn more about tuition billing, here's a great resource. But then there is a funding report that shows you, kind of what those tuition rates are for your district. So again, you go back to the Minnesota funding reports. I'll pick a different district. I will pick, we will go with, actually, I'm trying to think. We'll just go with Shakopee, just because that was when I was in, and we'll see how I did when I was there. There we go. Category, special education tuition billing, year 23, 24. Actually, we might need to do last year. See if I got the right report. Okay, so special education. Okay, just need to make sure. Regular school year. Regular school year calculation. So here's where I have the screenshot of the report that you want. Regular school year calculation. Okay. Regular school year calculation. Okay, so a challenge with this is MDE used to run reports that were similar, but by a different name. And they left all of those in there in case you want to run reports from about 7 years ago. So here's the correct one, regular school year calculation. And you pull that up. The first page just shows all of the different places that they are pulling the data. And then it starts to break down disability by disability. And so for the first one, 401, again, that's the disability code for students who have a speech or language impairment. Over in this corner is where they calculate that rate, which is $20.83. So what's even interesting is you look down at the next line, 402, which is mild to moderate DCD, that rate is 1606. That typically, when you look at what the cost of providing special ed services to a student who has a speech language impairment, compare that to a student who qualifies DCD mild to moderate, you want DCD mild to moderate to be higher. Some good starting points when looking at this report would be speech or language impairment. That often is going to be really high, which means that you generally have too many speech language pathologists coded to 401, and you can code them to any disability. And that doesn't mean that they can only work with students with that disability. They can work with any student. This is just how we're reporting data to MDE. So like I said, one good place to look is 401. Speech language impairment. Another one to look at is severely multiply impaired. This one is $29. It's not, that there are times that you will see speech language impairment have that rates, where that rate would show as $30, $40, $50 an hour, and severely multiply impaired will be at about $3. But what that means is if your rate is too high, you have too many staff coded there. If it's too low, you don't have enough. And that does it. And it's also calculated based on the number of students. So if you only have 10 students in your district that qualify SMI, that doesn't mean that you need to have 30 teachers or 30 paras coded to SMI, but it means you need to have a couple. Does this make a little bit of sense of like what this report is and kind of what it shows? Because this is where, when you look at your state aid, this is back to that comprehensive aid report, that is where this number really is driven, is that tuition adjustment is based off of the rates in here. There's more in here that if you really want to dive into your tuition billing rate, send me an email and I can go into more depth with you, because there are some tools that MDE has made available to help you kind of and make adjustments so that your tuition billing rates can start to be corrected, for lack of a better word. Okay. Questions about tuition billing? Okay. And then quick, I'll just do a little bit of an overview of third-party billing. So your big buckets of revenue are your state aid and your federal aid, but then districts do receive revenue from billing medical assistance. As many of you know, that there is a list of potentially eligible services, and these are all health-based services that we provide within our school system. It's all the things we know: physical therapy, speech language therapy, nursing, hopefully soon social work services. We are working hard. The application has been submitted to the federal level. We received some feedback. So hopefully, I mean, we are working towards social work services being eligible as well. And so how third-party billing works is you have to track and document the services that you are providing. Those get reported to the Department of Human Services, DHS, through Minnesota, which kind of oversees through the medical assistance benefits for families. And then districts would receive a rate, they would receive reimbursement for the services that they provided. And there's rate calculations within your districts for each one of these services. And then that amount gets billed to medical assistance. And then you receive 50% reimbursement. That is the medical assistance rate. So what you end up billing to medical assistance, assuming that it is eligible and meets all the MA requirements, you would receive 50% of that aid back. So third-party billing revenue can be used for almost anything. I have another slide a little bit later. I'll get to what you can use third-party billing for in just a second. There are some great resources that MDE has made available for third-party billing if it's something you want to dive into a little bit more. I put the flow here. It's back to this same special education funding guide. There's third-party funding, an overview of what that is, the use of third-party funding. This is a nice little one-pager that, depending on what you're using it for, it tells you how to code and enter that. So just some great resources for if one of the documents will give you an overview of how those rates are calculated too. I have another slide in just a second about eligibility there. Any questions about third-party billing? Okay. And then I think one of the big things that everybody is always wondering, okay, how do I pay for something? Do I code something to state? Do I code something to federal? Should I cover this with my third party? What can I do? One of the biggest components of special education is that funds can only supplement, they can't supplant. So in general, if general education is paying for something, you cannot use your special education funding to purchase that same equipment, materials, or supplies. We ran into that in my district this last summer, that the district had adopted a new literacy curriculum, and they hadn't ordered some of those same materials for our special education teachers at those grade levels. Because it's being provided to all of general education, I can't justify that as a special education expense. What I can do is, if it's only being purchased for elementary teachers, but there are some middle school teachers that need some of those materials, like I may be able to justify if it's not being provided at that same grade level and only going to be used for specialized instruction. But if general education is purchasing the exact same thing for general education, you can't use your special education funds. One of the best resources I have found for eligibility of expenditures is actually on this same special education funding guide that I have linked to a few times. Let me look back. I just want to make sure I get to the right one. Section 19. So Section 19, eligibility of expenditures. This was just updated last May. If you upload or download, unfortunately, they're all downloads, they're not live websites, and scroll down past all the explanation and overview of eligibility, it goes down and goes through broad categories. So if you're wondering, can I pay for, okay, sorry, no, you can't pay for alcoholic beverages, and you can't pay for aides or paraprofessionals for students without disabilities, but you can pay for, I'm just trying to get to one, audiology. You can cover your audiologist. The star means maybe, but then it'll give you a little bit of an explanation. So this is There's been a few times that I've referenced this when I've had a building principal say, hey, can you cover this? No, I'm sorry, like here's directly from MDE resource. And there are times that I pulled this up and reference that. So just wanted to share that this is a reference that's out there for you. And then just like a high level overview, when you're looking at state versus federal versus third party billing, the things you're going to code to state are generally the things that are directly for students or people that are working directly with your students. So this is going to be your special ed teachers who are working directly with students, paraprofessionals who are working directly with students, instructional materials that students are going to be using themselves. Your federal funds are generally going to be what are those supports for the educators that work with the students. And so it would be professional development for the teachers or for your, occupational therapists or your DHH teachers. If you are, paying for somebody to go to a conference, that would come out of your federal funds most of the time. If you have, a special education administrative assistant, to the director, that would typically come out of your federal funds. Third party billing is a bit of but for federal, you can code special education teachers or paraprofessionals or any of that to your federal funds. But typically you would code those to state. Third-party billing is a little bit of a wild card because you can code almost anything to third-party billing because the standard is to the benefit of students with disabilities. So really anything that you would have coded to state or would have coded to federal, you can code to third-party billing. Plus, there's a few times that you can use your third-party funds to pay for things that you wouldn't have been able to use your other special education funds for. Though there's only a few exceptions like that, but third-party billing can be a really nice source of funding to cover some things that maybe were unexpected in your budget if you have that, if you have a fund balance of your third-party billing funds. Okay, so we're just about done. That's kind of my final thought is special education funding is complex. Much of it doesn't make sense. I can't imagine anybody's walking away feeling like you're an expert because I don't think I'm an expert. And it's that every year I'm learning something new. But what I would say is like the most important thing is to know who are those people in your professional network that you can reach out to. Let me be a resource for you. If you have any questions, here's my email, here's my personal cell phone number. Please don't hesitate to reach out. It's one of the best parts of being involved with MASE is building out that network of support. And I love this stuff. When everything else is stressful and we're dealing with staffing issues and vacancies, my spreadsheets are my happy place. So it would actually be a treat to get to walk through any of this if there's anything you're wanting to learn more or wanting to apply. And I have those people that I reach out to as well. Just this afternoon, I got a call from a director where we were talking through some information that she had heard from MDE about special ed finance too. You don't have to be an expert in special education funding to be a leader in special education. And if you are heading into an interview and like it's okay to say, I'm learning about this, but here's what I know. I know that there are resources that the Minnesota Department of Education has available to support with special education finance. A person's name to throw out is Paul Farron. He is the supervisor of special education funding at MDE. He's hilarious. If I'm ever forming an all-star team for Trivial Pursuit, he's the first person I'm drafting. And then list out I can be a contact, that there are directors who love this even more than I do and have been diving into the funding formula and special ed finance longer than I have. There are people out there that would be more than willing to work with you. You don't have to be an expert, and don't let a fear of special ed finance ever hold you back from wanting to apply for a position or be in leadership. Again, it would be a thrill for me to get an email or a phone call from somebody saying, hey, I want to know more, or what you said made no sense. Can you break that down in a different way? So with that, any questions?
I don't see anything coming through in the chat, but I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, Heidi is amazing. She is definitely one of my go-to people when it comes to finance. And just watching this today, I learned even more. So every time I hear this stuff, I learn more and more. And just definitely what Heidi said, don't be afraid to reach out to people, and we're all here to help each other. Because yep, Sarah, thanks for adding that. The MDE webinars are a great resource too. Yeah, they're good. They're not quite as entertaining as Heidi, but they are a good resource. Yeah.
I would agree,
Yeah.
but yes.
Now, if you want real entertainment, like it's gotten so dark. If you want real entertainment, sit on a video call with Paul Farron. The cats are, it's funny. Awesome. Well, with that, we could be done about 5 minutes early, unless anybody has any questions. Thanks for sitting through this. I hope that this was a little bit helpful and that you're walking away with at least one or two things where it's like, huh, didn't necessarily know that before. So there you go. With that, have a great night.
Bye, everybody.